In this lecture, we are going to go over how to modify a Node application so that it can serve static assets like CSS files, static JavaScript files, favicons, and images. So before we start modifying the app, let's create a folder full of assets that are going to need to be served. So I'm going to make a new directory and call it public. Now let's create some files within that directory. I'm going to create a CSS file for the application. I'm going to create a client-side JavaScript file. You can see them getting created here. Now we want to add a favicon.ico, a logo file, and just a test JPEG. Rather than going into a drawing program and creating these images and files now, I'm just going to use ones that I've created for this lecture and paste them in. If you want these files, you can go to the GitHub that's linked from this lecture, go into the public folder, you'll see favicon.ico, logo.png, and test.jpg all in there, and you can go ahead and use those. So you can see I just placed these three files in here now. Within the app.js file, I'm just going to note that this is the front-end logic for the application. And all it's going to do so far is create an app object and then log out hello console world. We should see that within the Chrome console when we go to inspect the page that's rendered. Within app.css, I'm going to add a bunch of styles just to clean up what we've done so far. I'm going to note that this is the CSS styles for the application. Now I'm going to create a bunch of CSS that I don't want to waste your time with here because this isn't a front-end course, but if you want the CSS that we're going to be using, you can go ahead and grab it from the GitHub. When you get the version on GitHub, you'll see that this file is going to be changing with each lecture to only include the styles that are relevant to the particular lecture code that you're looking at, but I am just pasting in really all the CSS that we're going to need, and you're welcome to browse through it. You can find this final style sheet within a folder called Final within the section that we're in right now. You can see that it includes some resets, the main color palette, styles for the index page, and then styles for the account creation page and all the other pages on the site. We won't be returning to this CSS file again in this lecture, so I'll just leave it to you to look more deeply into it if you feel like it. We will, however, be adding pieces of front-end logic to the application in the app.js file as these lectures go on, because while that is a front-end thing, I do want to at least briefly go over how we're using client-side AJAX to interact with the RESTful API that we built. Now, we are going to add some logic to the application so that it can serve the static files, CSS, JavaScript, ICO, and images that we've created. Before we do that though, let me just modify this header so that it's going to have some real links in it. Home is going to go to /, sign up should go to account/create, login should go to session/create, the dashboard should go to checks all, the account settings page should be account/edit, and logout for now is just going to be a pound symbol. Later on, we'll bind the logout button to actually log you out and then redirect you to the logged out page. Now, as you can see in this header file, things like app.js are served from a public directory. The directory is actually called public, which corresponds to the folder that it's really in. So we need to go to our server and add a route called public. Also, since favicon.ico should be served from the base directory, not from the public folder, just by convention, we need to add that as well. So we're going to add a route called favicon.ico, which is going to be handled by handlers.favicon. And we want a public route that's handled by handlers.public. Now let's go to our handlers file and actually write those handlers. Below the index handler, I'm going to create a favicon handler first. So handlers.favicon is just like any other route, takes in data and a callback. And just like the index, we're going to reject any method that isn't a get. And return a 405. If it is a get, we actually want to serve the favicon. So we want to read in the favicons data. So for that, we're going to call a helper that we haven't written yet called helpers.getStaticAsset. We're going to say that the static asset is favicon.ico. And then we're going to expect an error and the favicon data to come back. If there isn't error and there is data, we're going to continue. Otherwise, we're going to call back 500. If everything is fine, we're just going to call back the data, which will look like callback 200, call back the raw data of the favicon, and then tell the server that the type that we're calling back is not JSON and is not HTML, it's actually going to be favicon. So when we go back to our server file, we're going to need to modify it to accept a favicon type as well. Now we're going to write another handler that just serves all the public assets that are within the public directory and any that we will be adding later. So this is going to be for public assets. I'm going to paste in the top of the favicon handler and then modify some things. So handlers.public is going to take in the same things and reject anything that isn't a get method with a 405. But for this method, since these URL requests are coming in as public/something, we have to determine what actual file is being requested. So get the file name being requested. And in order to figure out what they're asking for, we need to trim the word public off of the string that we're seeing in the path. So trimmed asset name is going to equal data trimmed path, replace the string public with an empty string. Now we want to say that if the trimmed asset name has a length greater than 0, we'll continue. Otherwise, we're going to call back 404. Now that we know which asset they're asking for inside of the public folder, we want to read in the asset's data. And we're going to do that the same way that we did above. Except instead of reading in favicon.ico, we're just going to read in trimmed asset name and then expect back the data of whatever that asset is. So if there isn't an error and there is data, we want to continue. Otherwise, we still want to call back a 404 because we couldn't find the asset that they're looking for. Now, in order to call back the data of this asset, we first need to determine what kind of asset it is, what kind of MIME type or what kind of file extension it has, so that when we call back, for example, the favicon data, as we are doing here, we can say that this is a type favicon. Otherwise, we don't know whether to tell our server they should be serving this as JSON or serving it as HTML or serving it as something else. So we are going to look at the file name again and determine what the content type should be. we want to determine the content type and default to plain text if we can't figure it out. So we're going to start off by saying the content type equals plain. If the trimmed asset name contains the string .css, then we want to say that the content type equals CSS. I'm going to copy this logic again because we are going to use it a few times. If the asset name contains .png, the content type is going to be PNG. If it contains .jpeg, the content type is going to be JPEG. If it contains .ico, because instead of requesting the ICO, the favicon, at the base URL, they're requesting it from the public folder here, then we still want to be able to serve it from there, and the content type is going to equal favicon. Then we want to call back the data. So we're going to say callback 200, the data, and the content type. Now that we've done this, we can go and return to our server file and modify it so that it can accept all these content types that it currently could not. So we're going to go to this section where we're currently only choosing between JSON and HTML and add support for all these other content types. So we'll leave the payload string defined. If content type is JSON, that's what we want to do. If content type equals HTML, that's what we want to do. But now we're going to copy this HTML block down below because we want to add on logic for favicon, plain text, CSS, PNG, and JPEG. So we are going to say, if the content type is favicon, we want to set the header content type to equal image/x-icon. If the content type is CSS, we want to set the header content type to text/CSS. If it's PNG, we want to set the header to image/PNG. If it's JPEG, we want to set the header to image/JPEG, JPEG. And if the content type is plain, then we want to set the content type to text/plain, and that would be the default. But before this works, we referenced some helpers a moment ago in our handlers, get static asset to be specific. And so now within helpers, we need to write the get static asset function. So down at the bottom of the file, we're going to write this new function, which is going to let us get the contents of a static, aka public, asset. It's going to be called helpers.getStaticAsset. It's going to be a function that, as you've seen, takes in a file name and a callback. It's going to sanity check the file name, equals type of file name equals string, and file name length is greater than 0, file name or false. It's only going to continue if there was a real file name found. Otherwise, it's going to call back the error, a valid file name was not specified. If the file name is there, then we need to define the public directory folder, much in the same way we defined the data folder and the templates folder before that. So we're going to say that public dir equals path join directory name and join it to //public/. Now we're going to try to read the file in. So fs.readFile, the public directory plus the file name. And it should give back an error and data. If there's no error and there is data, we'll go ahead and call back no error and data. But if we hit an error, we'll call back no file could be found. Now that that helper exists, our handlers should be able to read in these static assets. That's both the public handler and our favicon handler. So if we start the app back up, we should be able to render this new page with these static assets being served. I'm going to go back to the browser, refresh here. We haven't seen the CSS change here, so the CSS is not loading, and now we just need to figure out why. Look at the network, refresh the page, see if we have any indication. Yes, we are getting a 404 from the app.css public route, and so now we need to figure out why. Yes, this is because within our server file, we have defined this route, public handlers.public. But these routes don't take any kind of wildcards. This route is only going to match the public path exactly. So the only way handlers.public is going to get called right now is if these assets were sitting exactly at /public, which they're not. They're sitting at /public/ their own name. So we actually need to modify our server logic just a little bit so that public/anything, for example, public/star, ends up getting routed to the handlers.public handler. So when we are choosing a handler, we just need to add a little bit more logic. If the request is within the public directory, use the public handler instead. So we want to say that the chosen handler defined above equals trimmed path index of public/ greater than -1. In other words, if the path that they're requesting includes the string public/anything, then we want to switch from whatever chosen handler we just got, whether it is the 404 handler or some other handler, to handlers.public. Otherwise, default to the chosen handler, whatever it was. So in this case, this path we created down here is only getting called if somebody references /public and doesn't include anything. So now we should be able to start our server back up and try that again. I'm going to refresh, and good. Now we can see that app.css is being returned, but we still don't see the styles changing, which means we still have some issue somewhere. If I open up the app.css that got returned, we can see that the content type is coming back to us correctly, but the response is empty, and we should see CSS inside of there. So let's go back to our app and try to figure out why. It looks like the issue is that we are making sure that the payload is always a string before we write it out. But upon second consideration, we have to realize that HTML will be a string, but favicons and others will be buffers that have been read in from a file. And so they will fail this validation. So rather than saying that the payload should be a string for all of these types, we're just going to say that the payload should not be undefined. Restart the app back up and try it one more time. All right, looks like we have some CSS appearing, so things are working well. But if we look in the console and refresh, we don't see that log that we put in app.js. Also, the network does not show app.js as being loaded at all. So if we view source, we can still see that the application is referencing public/app.js. So we just have to figure out what else the issue might be. It might very well be that we are misspelling text/JavaScript we missed an A in JavaScript, so I'll make that edit and try again. Now we're refreshing this, and we can see app.js is getting loaded. In the console, we can see hello console world. So the CSS is getting loaded, the JavaScript is getting loaded. Now let's try to navigate to the images that we placed. Let's check public/logo.png, and we see this logo. This is being transmitted to us with the content type image/png. Now let's navigate to test.jpg and see there we have Dave Chappelle staring at us. And this JPEG is being transmitted with the content type image/JPEG. So those images should be working fine. Now we want to modify the template so that the logo appears in the upper left-hand corner. So within the logo A tag, I'm going to add an image tag, and the source is going to equal public/logo. Because of the base URL, again, we don't need to reference a backslash there. Public/logo.png. Now we can refresh this page. And we see the logo in the upper left-hand corner. Now, one thing you're not seeing is the favicon up here, but that is because browsers tend to heavily cache the favicon, whether it exists or it doesn't. If we navigate to the favicon.ico, we can see this small black dot here, indicating that it actually does exist. And we can inspect it and see the favicon is getting transmitted. The response exists, and it's coming through with image/xicon as the content type. Now we have static asset serving working fine, and we can move on to the next lecture where we will be creating the basic scaffolding for the index page.